Is rioting and protesting effective in bringing about social change? The death of 46-year-old Black man George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, sparked a massive wave of protests that spread on a global scale. Floyd's tragic death occurred after white police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for almost 9 minutes, while Floyd was handcuffed and lying face down on the street. Everyone participating in the protests united to fight against systemic racism and lingering injustices such as problematic laws, white privilege, racial discrimination, police brutality, and a staggering wealth gap between people of color and white people. However, some protests turned into riots when protesters started looting and vandalizing public and private property. The situation sparked a debate as to whether protest, violent or not, can be an effective catalyst for political change. The language of the oppressed. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, a riot is the language of the unheard. King addressed the underlying causes of protests and riots to bring our attention to the fact that if there weren't deep, persisting issues, people would not take to the streets. The truth of the matter is that America was founded on riots. From as far back as the days of tar and feathering British tax collectors, citizens have resisted power by fighting back, using fists when their voices weren't heard. Protests were more often than not the result of racial and economic inequalities, have exploded into a mess of arson, looting, and police brutality in the summer of 2020. The question is whether these cries for equality will actually be heard. What sort of progress is made with protests? Do they actually make conditions better? The power of nonviolent resistance. Nonviolent resistance is a relatively new path to social justice, but it's an extremely powerful and effective one. Peaceful stances against unequal civil rights have been successful throughout history, and nonviolent movements can lead to a meaningful systemic change. Reflecting back on several landmark moments can act as a guide for action in these tumultuous times to gain equality for all lives in society. Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of peaceful activism in U.S. history, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, took place on August 26, 1963. More than 200,000 Americans marched to promote racial equality and justice, led by Martin Luther King Jr., who concluded the march by giving his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." The day was peaceful and joyful, culmination of speeches, songs, and prayer led by politicians, clergymen, entertainers, and civil rights leaders. The day brought hope and a renewed strength and determination to the civil rights movement that was taking place in the 1960s, a time when racial inequality and prejudice were overtly prevalent. Within this time of injustice, Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice proclaimed, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." His dream taught a suffering nation that they could dream as well.